What you're about to see are lessons bought at a high and awful price. They are meant to keep you alive, safe, and should you ever need them, they are the lessons meant to guide you and your loved ones through the worst day of your life. My name is Christopher Allen Smith. Until November 8th, 2018, this was my home in Paradise, California. It's where my wife and I raised our 2 boys, and it was from here we fled as the Campfire tore into our town. The disaster displaced over 52,000 people from Concal, Magnolia, Paradise, Yankee Hill, and other parts of the Paradise Ridge. And it killed 85 of our friends and neighbors. These lessons saved us. Many were learned from previous disasters and passed on by first responders, government officials, and ordinary citizens wanting to help. Some are new, because now it's our turn to pass on what we learned. While our disaster was fire, these are meant to help you and yours survive disasters of all kinds. They're for everyone: civilians and first responders, risk managers in the private sector, and disaster planners at every level of government, from town councils to national capitals. It's all here for everyone, because the first step in preparing is to know as much as you can.
You know, we knew as fire service professionals that Paradise was susceptible to fire. I mean, Paradise is a geographic plateau, sits in the foothills of Northern California in a Mediterranean climate. It's got a timbered forest, overstory forest. It's surrounded by the very deep and steep canyon in the west, Butte Creek Canyon, and also to the east by the west branch of the North Fork of another very, very steep and narrow canyon, actually.
It's the epitome of an urban interfaced area, and it's always been talked about of the potential of something catastrophic happening to that entire general area.
And here is the first lesson. Do not live in fear, but accept there is a real chance a disaster will happen to you. Right now, you may be thinking, it can happen to you, but you don't really feel it. Nothing this big ever happens to you. But take it from me. It happens. This is a list of common disasters, based on one maintained by the Red Cross. Now, maybe there's never been a tornado where you live, but what about a chemical train derailment, an earthquake, a mass shooting? Chances for any one of these is small. But the more things happen, you will encounter at least something on this list. Now is not the time to panic. Now is the time to prepare. Hurricanes are named after people. Earthquakes tend to be named after years. Fires are named after places. This is Camp Creek Road. It's the closest geological feature to where the Campfire started. But this is not the Campfire you're thinking of.
Fire is driven by 3 predominant fire behavior factors: topography, fuels, and weather. When I talk about fuels, we predominantly talk about forest fuels: grass, brush, and timber. But fuel is anything that burns. It could be a vehicle, it could be a structure. We as CALFIRE have used varying scenarios in many of our classes, including our Operations Section Chief class. In Paradise fire scenario, where a fire would burn from one of those drainages up into town, was certainly one of the scenarios.
The biggest fire in the history of Butte County started here, and it was called the Campfire. But you've probably never heard of it. That's because it started in 2008 and was one of many fires which burned through the county that summer. So many, in fact, the collection was given a new name, the Lightning Complex.
So back in 2008, I was the district's representative in the EOC. And so I spent several days in the EOC working with town officials, fire officials.
Marcus is talking about something every level of government should have. It's called an Emergency Operations Center, or EOC. This is Butte County's EOC. It allows disaster responders to concentrate information, efforts, and communication when the chaos of a disaster strikes. It makes responses immensely more efficient. In Butte County, it works like this. When a disaster strikes, the county opens the EOC, the Butte County Sheriff opens their Incident Command Center, and CALFIRE opens their Incident Command Center. Firefighters put out the fire, law enforcement evacuates areas in danger, and the county opens shelters and gets resources from within the county, from other counties, from the state, or the federal government, depending on the scale of the disaster.
People ask me, what's it like? I say it's kind of like being in a war room, plotting evacuations, obtaining current information, trying to make projections about direction of fire impacts.
Over the course of 5 weeks, the Lightning Complex fire burned 88,000 acres. Earlier that summer, another fire, the Humboldt Fire, burned 24,000 acres, destroyed 74 structures, and prompted the evacuation of most of Paradise. That evacuation resulted in people stuck on narrow, wooded roads for as much as 12 hours. While no one was killed, the 2008 Summer of Fire struck many observers as a bullet very narrowly dodged. In the years that followed, first responders, local and state officials, and civilians from every corner of the county came together to create plans and make changes so the next time the Paradise Ridge faced a fire, things would go better.
We learned a lot in 2008.
Many of our foothill communities have very limited ingress and egress. For instance, Paradise has, as we know, 4 routes out to the west and south from town, and 1 route to the north that at the time did not go all the way through. And then other communities have only 1 way in and 1 way out. And we always know that those communities are vulnerable. The population density in Paradise, obviously 26,500 people at the time of the fire roughly, and in Magalia another 11 to 13,000 people. When you put that many people on very limited roadways, traffic is going to back up and it's going to get jammed. I think one of the biggest things that we learned is the understanding and the need to maximize our ability to use what limited traffic lanes that we have out of a community to maximize the flow.
That's where they ended up developing zones.
Maybe the best program disaster planners made famous after the 2008 fires were the evacuation zones. The town, county, CALFIRE, and the sheriff revamped and widely publicized evacuation zones for Paradise, Magalia, and Concow.
There's 14 in the town of Paradise, and the zones in Paradise are numbered, and the zones in Magalia and elsewhere in the county are geographically labeled.
Evacuation zones work like this. Citizens sign up for a notification system and learn their zone. Mine was 11. When the disaster hits, automatic calls go out informing citizens if their zone got an evacuation warning, making them aware of the danger, giving them the chance to pack up and get ready to go, or an evacuation order. That way, people truly at threat would get on the road and get out, while those safe from danger could stay at home or work and keep the streets free.
I think probably one of the most significant things that was done was the paving of the roadway from Inskip over to Butte Meadows, up Skyway and Inskip over to Butte Meadows. And you may recall that there was a significant effort to get that roadway paved, the primary impetus being that it would be an alternate route to evacuate people.
Another improvement was a major upgrade to the emergency mass notification system, the system county and town officials use to let citizens know of danger.
It was a dial-up system, and we quickly moved to a web-based system where more calls could be made.
There was a significant emphasis on training, preparation, making sure we had adequate plans and facilities for how we were going to address any sort of disaster, whether it be flooding or a fire or an earthquake, anything like that.
The community evacuation plans, they've been updated a couple of times since then. The town especially has done a lot of work on one-way evacuations, Contraflow, turning a 2-lane going in opposite directions into one-way, both lanes going the same direction to get people out. We have a registry in Butte County, the Special Needs Awareness Program, SNAP, and that registry took a dramatic change after the 2008 fires. And the Disaster Preparedness Committee met with local law and fire folks and said, what do you need to know? And the answer was, we need people who need extra help evacuating, folks that are wheelchair users, or maybe bedbound, or particularly frail. People can go online and either register online or there's a phone number they can call. It's not a guarantee of being evacuated, but it does help give people some planning measures.
We changed the Town of Paradise and Upper Ridge evacuation plan to follow the national Ready, Set, Go format. Ready being things to do to be ready before the fire season hits. Defensible space, a home evacuation plan, getting your go bag together, all of those things that one should do in the spring before the summer sets in. The next part was the get set. Get set is just that. It's sort of like being on deck in the batter's box. Hey, there's a fire that's near me. It's not necessarily impacting me now, but I gotta get my last minute things together. I gotta get the go bag, I gotta grab my medicines. I've got to make sure that I have my pets and their resources and their go bag and those kinds of things, and collect those and get them ready. And then of course the go is just that. That's when you receive official notification or it becomes obvious, and I think that's the thing that people need to realize. First responders working with law enforcement will do everything we can to notify people, but sometimes there are going to be events that develop so rapidly that there isn't time, or systems go down, infrastructure goes down, and we're not able to notify everybody, and that's in essence a no-notice event.
A no-notice event. That's a polite phrase for what separates an emergency from a disaster. Emergencies can be handled. Disasters cannot. At least for a while. A no-notice event did come to Butte County. 18 months before the fire, a tear opened in the spillway of the Oroville Dam after especially heavy rains. Concerned with the reservoir's water levels as the rains continued, officials decided to let water over the emergency dirt spillway, and it began to erode.
We were looking at the potential of a 30-foot high wall of water, about 1,300 feet long, cascading down the side of the mountain, taking with it everything in its path. And when I asked them to explain to me again how fast it was moving, they said 30 feet an hour. And I said, well, how close is it? And they said, we think it's about 30 feet away.
Oroville was evacuated, and over 100,000 people were in danger, from Butte County all the way to Sacramento.
I believe that our experiences with the Oroville Dam spillway evacuation informed and guided our response to the Campfire evacuation.
The plans worked. Tens of thousands had been evacuated without the loss of a single life.
I would say if you spoke to me on November 7th, I would have said, you know what, we have a good plan in place. We planned for different events. I felt that we have a good response plan. It's all scripted. Unfortunately, that all went out the window on November 8th.
Which brings us to this. As a citizen, you've thought about your family's needs, medical concerns, pets, and what you should pack. You know your evacuation zone. As a disaster agency, you've gotten your EOC ready, made plans, backup plans, and alternates. You've trained your employees and bought the gear first responders will need. But somewhere in your disaster plan should be this sentence. There is a very real chance you will need to ignore your disaster plan. Take it from me, that's not as scary as it sounds. Now we come to it. What it's really like to run for your life. But this story is not mine, mostly. After all, conveying the experience of tens of thousands fleeing the Paradise Ridge is too much for this video. So we're going to follow the story of this man, Bob Irvine.
I am the Executive Director for California Vocations. We're a nonprofit to support adults with developmental disabilities. I would say we do a good job in ensuring our clients get an inclusive lifestyle to where they're out in the community and not sheltered in the homes.
Bob's clients are part of the access and functional needs population. In a way, they are the hardest case when it comes to reacting to a disaster. If preparations can work for them, they can work for almost anyone.
Access and functional needs. Now it includes anyone who is disabled, whether that be physically or cognitively disabled, if they're elders, if they're pregnant, if they're non-English speaking, if they have transportation issues, which, as you know, in our county, we have a lot of rural, remote areas. The Ridge area had a very high percentage of access and functional need. 25% of the population just in Paradise alone was over the age of 65.
People like Bob's clients with challenges to health and understanding are often the first to suffer in a disaster. That's why Bob's team at California Vocations has prepared for the worst, along with the disaster planners of Paradise and Butte County. It was these plans that saw Bob, his employees, and clients, over 250 in all, through one of the most destructive fires in American history.
Well, we're required as a licensed facility to do disaster drills every 6 months and fire drills every month. So we were doing the drills where we would load up the car. We didn't necessarily go to an off-site location, but we did the drill in the middle of the night even, where we would evacuate the home into the vehicles. So at least our clients could get a routine down, so they weren't so alarmed and panic if it were ever to happen.
We talk about the worst case scenario, but what we should call it is the worst case imaginable. True worst cases are often much worse than anything in our preparations. An unsinkable ship hits an iceberg in a way no ship has hit any iceberg before. Teams of terrorists hijack 4 planes, all at the same time. A decades-old flaw in concrete shreds open a spillway and threatens 100,000 people. What binds these disasters is that they were all possible, but challenging even for the best planners to anticipate. For my community, the worst case possible came at 6:25 in the morning in a place 10.2 miles from my front door.
At the time I saw the smoke plume, I said, here we go again. Reminded me of the previous time we were evacuated. So I basically, this time, I thought it was smart, and I packed my own bag and then went to the office.
As Bob went to his office, CALFIRE Chief John Messina went to his office, of sorts. He had just arrived in Polga, and it was his job to stop the campfire.
And we were kind of going through our normal process, and it became evident real quick that being normal that day wasn't going to work. The fire was escalating, and we were having impacts to, civilian population immediately. Every decision we made, even though we thought we were hours ahead of it, we were minutes behind it.
At this point, many in town and in disaster response still thought it was a normal grass fire. In Southern Paradise, I left my home to take my youngest to high school in Chico. About when I did, Bob was arriving at work.
Got to Cypress Lane. Clients were already starting to arrive for the day program. Kind of anxious, nervous. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? The staff were calling them down. I went down. We had 2 residential facilities on that property. So I went down to one of them to make sure things were going okay, see if I could help in any way. Things were actually very orderly. I was very impressed with our staff. They were busy packing up medical records for the clients, things of that nature that we might use.
By now, the smoke plume was so large, everyone in the county could see it. Among the first to learn the true danger was Sherry McCracken, the Chief Administrative Officer of Butte County. She was on the phone with Darren Reed, the head of CALFIRE in Butte County. It's Sherry's job to manage the county's Emergency Operations Center when it opens.
So Chief Reed said, we have a fire. I said, yeah, I saw that. It's like 15 acres. Just in the minute or something we had talked, it had already grown. And I would say by the time we stopped talking, it was 1,500 acres. And he said, this is going to be bad. And I said, I got to get to the office. I have to say, when we got in the Emergency Operations Center, we had no internet, no email, no landlines, and spotty cell phone and text. So we were all operating off of cell phones.
We need to talk about plans. By their nature, disasters are the worst chaos can give us. So applying rigid, pre-made plans is like resisting the incoming tide. New York had to evacuate its EOC in response to the September 11th attacks. Butte County had to evacuate its EOC in response to the 2017 Oroville Dam crisis. Paradise had to evacuate its EOC almost before it opened the morning of the campfire. But all that planning does leave behind something essential.
No disaster is the same.
Semper Gumby, we like to say. You have to be flexible. You have to have plan A, B, and C, and know in the back of your mind, okay, I know this is the plan, but sometimes that plan doesn't work out, and we've got backups and backups.
The preparations give you confidence to know what you're supposed to do.
Even when you don't use them, plans give you focus on what's essential. Focus gives you the ability to improvise elements of your plan to survive the disaster you face. This dynamic was at play for disaster responders from the first hour of the campfire.
Our focus that day as public safety officials, our focus is life safety, number one. Firefighters and civilians, number one, and public safety officials. Number two is protecting personal property, homes, vehicles. Number three is the wildland. And that day, so many people were impacted so early. Very little firefighting went on early on in the fire because all the resources were dedicated just to securing people and getting them out of their neighborhoods, their homes, their community.
Typically your average wildland fire, from everything that I've heard and been involved with, spreads somewhere between about 1.4 to 1.9 miles per hour. You know, the campfire was unfortunately the perfect storm.
It was purely driven by wind, and it became a blizzard of embers that caused new fires out in front of the main body of the fire, that those fires then developed rapidly. And it went from a fire started in a remote area of Polga to a community of Concow in an hour, to a community of Paradise, which was an additional 3.2 miles in another half an hour. So in an hour and a half time, 7.5 miles.
Now, spot fires aren't uncommon in a wind-driven fire. Probably around 7:55, we realized nothing normal is going on right now. Typically, our firefighters give us our intelligence on fire spread. The only reports of fire spread we were getting were from 911 calls coming in.
The staff came in and said there's spot fires out there, so they immediately started going out and putting out fires that were in our yard. And that created a little bit sense of urgency on people's minds that it might not be the usual evacuation that we did before.
So people did not have a chance. I mean, they had to flee immediately.
And you never want to evacuate a town with a population density of Paradise coupled with Magalia's population density all at once. That's not the desired outcome. However, Mother Nature dictates to firefighters and to law enforcement when we have to make a decision as to what zones need to be evacuated. And Mother Nature's hand played out rapidly that day.
Everywhere, first responders, civilians, and disaster planners were adapting. Evacuation orders went out to every zone in Paradise, Concow, and Magalia. Soon, 52,000 people were fleeing the ridge. But the fire was moving so fast, the plan to use Contraflow, one-way traffic out of town, had not yet been executed. Where the Skyway entered Paradise, Sheriff Honea was working to change that.
There is a desire in those situations to get a bunch of resources in place before you ultimately initiate Contraflow. You want to have signage in place, you want to have people at intersections capable of controlling the intersections that are going to be impacted by the Contraflow, and ideally have a law enforcement vehicle initiate the Contraflow and lead the caravan, if you will. We were overwhelmed. I went to the area on the Skyway that it splits into two. And I stopped there and basically made the decision that we didn't have time to wait. We needed to get people going down the Skyway in both directions. The other side was already impacted, bumper to bumper. And so at that point, I recognized that there was a risk that if cars were coming up the Skyway on the normal flow of traffic, if I sent other cars down there, that could create a problem. But I just didn't feel at that point we had time to wait for everything. So I radioed my dispatch center and I told them to contact Chico PD and tell the unit who was at the base of the Skyway at Bruce Road that we were going to be sending traffic the wrong way down Skyway to make sure that they didn't send anybody up. Then came the task of actually getting that done, operationalizing that. And so there was a guy standing west of me. He was down the side of the road, his truck was parked, he just was looking towards the fire. And I didn't have any other resources at that time, so I yelled for that guy to come over. I said, listen, I need you to help me get these cars directed down the road, and I need to get more resources here, so while I'm doing that, I'm gonna have you help me with that. And he said, okay. Went then to the row of cars that was proceeding down the Skyway the right way and started directing them over to me. And the first car, I basically explained to them that I was sending them down the Skyway and that they were the first car to be going, and that I didn't know if there was any traffic coming up, and that they were going to essentially lead the pack, but they needed to be careful about what they might encounter as they came.
At my home in Lower Paradise, I received 2 automated evacuation calls in quick succession. One was an evacuation warning for my zone, 11, and the next was an evacuation order for every zone in Paradise. I didn't know it at the time, but I was one of the lucky few to receive these calls. Because of the messages disaster planners had spread since the 2008 fires, we were ready. While I can't prove it, I think I was the last person to leave town without having to drive through fire. Bob was not so lucky.
Probably around 9 o'clock is when you started hearing the explosions. So everybody assumed that they were propane. So folks got in, a house across the street was fully engulfed in flames. It was obvious that the fire was upon us and we had to leave. I was actually the last one to leave 1620 Cypress. I went through all the buildings to make sure nobody was there.
Now we come to the part where there's more story than we can tell.
I had heard reports of people, trying to get their kids from the Ponderosa Elementary School, people trapped in traffic. I had heard about firefighting and rescue efforts going on at Feather River Hospital, where firefighters were trying to keep the fire knocked down around the hospital while hospital personnel, doctors, nurses, and paramedics were assisting trying to get patients loaded and out of the hospital.
In the years to come, you will hear these stories, and hundreds more. But what's essential to take away is another lesson. Stay calm.
It was all about ensuring people were getting in their vehicles, getting on the roadways, were following one another out of town. And what was remarkable to me is while it was bumper to bumper, most people, by far, most people maintained composure. They stayed in line with the vehicle in front of them. As the vehicle in front moved up, they moved up.
I asked CALFIRE which way I should turn once I get up to Clark Road. And he said, go towards Skyway and then come evacuate down the Skyway. So that's when it was just a parking lot. But everybody was being very patient. The only scary part was when you weren't moving.
I saw very few people panic. I saw very few people get really outwardly agitated. We had fire that was mostly burning surface fuels, but occasionally would crown what we refer to as fire moving into the canopy of the crown of the tree, and would burn maybe one tree or 10 trees or a group of trees, and that was occurring here and there around the area. And fortunately, none were impinged immediately. Some were close, but most cars stayed in line and they just moved out of town.
We kind of made our way over to Skyway. And then once we were on Skyway, it was really moving. They had opened up both lanes, but the fires were really intense on both sides.
Even when the disaster is unfolding around you, even when things seem slow, and even when things look bad, your composure will be the thing that helps you survive. Chief Messina had a term for this.
Sometimes, slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
The idea is being slow means continual, constant movement. Fast in chaotic situations means accidents, which stops everything.
But when people act out like that and freak out, for lack of a better term, it brings chaos and just go across country. It precipitates the fear. And actually, I only saw one individual do that. He did go around off the road and did go around and ultimately ended up 5 cars ahead of where he was before.
And we go by a model of, you risk a lot to save a lot. And so we were trying to explain to him, today's the day we risk a lot.
it destroyed everything. People were basically left with what they had on their back or what they were able to grab quickly.
It was just, that first week, even that first day, second day was shock. I think sitting in a building, not at the incident, not seeing paradise, it was hard for any of us to fathom.
When you're talking thousands of houses, thousands of businesses, it is truly like a bomb went off. Driving up that first day and seeing power lines down, power poles across the street, trees broken off, sheared off, all that's left are chimneys. It was like a ghost town.
The Campfire did in the first day what the lightning complex did in several weeks. The lightning complex was about 5 weeks worth of firefighting efforts over late June and all the way through July. The Campfire, 40,000 acres roughly within 6 to 8 hours, 85,000 acres by the time nightfall came.
By the time night fell on November 8th, over 50,000 people had evacuated from Paradise, Magalia, Concow, and eastern Chico. The number of structures destroyed was almost 1,000 more than in the Great Chicago Fire. An area larger than Washington, D.C. and San Francisco combined had burned in 12 hours. By the time it was extinguished 15 days later, 153,000 acres had burned. That's 75% of New York City. This is the Campfire burn scar compared to Los Angeles, Atlanta, and London. 85 people had perished.
The first night, I thought we'd have at least 1,000 people deceased. I knew the demographics of the ridge. I knew how many assisted living facilities and board and cares that we had there.
I think after the 2008 fires that we had, where we'd exercised evacuations and we knew where the flaws were, we felt we fixed them and had a pretty robust evacuation plan. Fire department and law enforcement had done a very good job educating people. The information was there, it was out there, and I truly believe if that wouldn't have happened, and if this fire, the Campfire on November 8th would have happened in 2007, I think you would have saw hundreds of fatalities, if not in the thousands.
Even though we were probably one of the best prepared counties, we had done drills, we had done tabletop exercises, we had communicated with our residents about where to go, what is your zone for evacuation purposes. We'd pushed code red. All of those best laid plans, nothing could have compared to what actually happened.
We've been talking a lot about this in the last 11 months. There are those occasions that there's going to be events. There's absolutely nothing we as human beings can do to prevent from it happening. But we still have to prepare for it, and we need to prepare for that 99.999% of natural disasters that hit us. That small percentage that we don't know how bad it is, that's always going to be looming out there.
One of the hardest things to put into words is what it feels like to live through a disaster. How quickly everything we know changes, and how quickly we adapt. Part of it is this. In our lives, we build up big moments. Graduations, funerals, weddings, births. There's the anticipation, the moment of excitement or stress, and then things return to a norm we're familiar with. That's because normal is often associated with going home after it all. When disaster happens, home is gone. Feeling normal is months or years away. But in Butte County, even with their plans overwhelmed, the guidelines of the disaster plans still helped house thousands of survivors on that first day.
There's calculations in emergency management that you estimate whatever the population is, that you would expect 10% of that population to show up on the doorstep of a shelter. And then of that 10%, then you estimate a particular percentage of individuals who would come with access and functional needs. And we use a formula, and we have a tool, planning tool that we utilize. And it calculates how many cots you'll need, how many meals you'll need, what kind of space you need. There's actually requirements for how many square feet you need per person. So the first 24 hours is just, as you can imagine, chaotic. About 9:30, the first shelter had been opened. And so then I was tasked with opening up additional shelters, getting resources requested and getting them into place, and dealing with everything related to the evacuation. So there were a total of 12 that were open within the first 24 hours. Some of those were county sponsored, some of them were what we call spontaneous shelters, and oftentimes in those spontaneous sheltering situations, they are churches or businesses who want to open their doors, but they're not necessarily trained. And so then over time, we try to support them, whether that be in the form of food or cots or bedding, whatever it is that they need, but not always. And then over time, during the course of an incident, we will try to support those spontaneous shelters in closing, and then we'll relocate those survivors to a more formal shelter, one that's managed by Red Cross and operated in conjunction with either a church or the county.
Among those looking for someplace to stay was Bob Irvine from California Vocations, his 50 clients and 200 employees. Like everybody else, Bob was using the elements of his pre-disaster plan to improvise a way to safety.
The plan was two things. One, to start securing hotel rooms in the area, and then two, we'll do a rendezvous at the fairgrounds down in Chico, so we'll all get together. Unfortunately, we didn't realize the emergency response units kind of used the fairgrounds for their site, so they weren't letting anybody there. Our rendezvous site was not available, and so we were all communicating via cell phone. Where are you? Where are you? And a large group of us went out to Woodson Bridge, to the campground there. One of our managers, Arlene Cruz, was very familiar with that property and the owners, and they took us in. So whoever couldn't find a hotel ended up going to Woodson Bridge. And there was, I would say, out of the 50 clients, there was probably 20 clients there. And the others were able to secure hotel rooms, but we were spread out all throughout Northern California. We were in Yuba City, we were in Corning, we were in Anderson. It was a realization that this situation was not sustainable, and it was bigger than us. So at that point in time, I sent an email to every elected official that I knew, county, state, United States, and said, pleading for help. We had the 50 clients, we had 250 employees, and who knows what our properties burnt.
This was Bob's version of a common survivor experience. You don't just lose things, you lose where you live, your security. Of the tens of thousands who came off the ridge during the fire, roughly 5,200 were being housed in public shelters spread from Yuba City to Redding. Hundreds more in spontaneous shelters, while tens of thousands more fleeing survivors were spread in homes of friends, family, hotel rooms paid by private insurance or FEMA, from Medford to Fresno, the Bay Area to Reno. I know families who fled as far away as Idaho, Texas, Georgia, and Florida to find friends with which to stay. One of the people Bob reached out to was Doug Teeter, the county supervisor for the Paradise Ridge. Teeter himself had nearly perished the morning of November 8th, along with a group of stranded motorists on Pearson Road. When they escaped, Teeter made his way to the EOC, where he saw Bob's call for help and responded.
And it was Doug Teeter, actually, that called me back first, saying he's working with Shelby Boston. 10 minutes later, she called me, and she said, Bob, I've got a county supervisor over in Colusa County that has offered up a 42-unit migrant housing camp, and it's got 42 duplexes. Would you be willing to use those as your shelter? I just couldn't believe it. It was amazing. I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for Shelby Boston.
After a few days, after like the first 3 days, then you start to have all these other things that pop up during a disaster. So we had spontaneous shelter at the Walmart parking lot we were contending with. We had just the different things that happen in shelters. You know, challenges with toilets and challenges with norovirus outbreaks. Things that happen when you have hundreds of people living in close quarters and you're just going through that every day is what's going to be the new challenge for today. Do you have someone who's become really ill, a survivor who needs special attention?
Emergency Manager Dunsmoor tried to put it into context like this.
In past events, in our EOC, our logistics section usually receives resource requests in 100, maybe 150 for things that are needed out in the field. In the Campfire, we received between 2,500 and 3,000 resource requests.
I gave several tours to different groups, whether it was FEMA or ACF or CDC. Every tour I provided, every conversation I had with anyone who lives and breathes emergency management, they all said the same thing, that it was that the level of destruction was something they'd never seen before. To have an entire town, with the exception of 1,300 homes, to be gone in a matter of hours was just unheard of. When we were talking about the impacts of the fire, that it was really akin to the 1906 earthquake. That people who survived the 06 earthquake, that became a part of who they are, became their life story, a chapter in it at least. And that the Campfire has become a chapter in all of our lives. While it wasn't the biggest fire ever in the history of California, it was the most destructive. And it was 155,000 acres, which there's bigger fires. But the fatality rate, the just mass destruction, it's pretty unbelievable.
So what do we take from all this, as citizens, as disaster planners, and first responders? Here's the first lesson. It's bigger than you think.
Oh, I think that our preparations missed the worst case scenario. The true worst case scenario is that what happened in the Campfire. It moved so quickly.
Survivor guilt is a real thing, and I felt bad that I had a home to go to. I felt horrible that my dog was at home waiting for me. I don't know about anybody else, but it's hard for me to explain because it's very personal. What each one of us went through, we took it personally in a different way. And I can talk to other people who went through it and we get it. We get how each other feels. But to try to explain it to someone from out of the area who didn't live through it, it's almost impossible. And I've had some other groups say, well, we're doing an exercise. What can you tell us about, what are some things we should include? And it's like, okay, have it wipe out everything at 70 miles an hour and then have it happen when there's 3 major holidays in the mix. And because that adds whole nother level of emotional stress.
Think much larger than you've ever thought before, because it's easy for us to sit around and say, well, I don't know why you didn't think of that. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback. But I can tell you, I've been doing this for 36 years and there's a lot of people around me that have had equal or more time, and none of us thought that would happen.
This idea came up over and over in these interviews and gets at the heart of disaster planning. If we could anticipate and prepare for every possible disaster, we could predict the future. But we can't. By their nature, disasters surprise and overwhelm. plans failing to anticipate every detail is not a symptom of their failure, but the most common outcome of chaos. But this does not mean plans are useless. As we've seen, they help improvising and save lives immensely, even when they're imperfect. And a useful rule of thumb did emerge. When you try to imagine the worst case in your area, earthquake, tornado, disease, anything, imagine the worst you can, then make it 10 times bigger and 10 times faster.
Wherever you are, we have to think about what would happen if we had a Katrina and it flooded the entire New Orleans area. What would happen if we had a fire and it didn't just glance across Paradise but burned through Paradise? Or an earthquake that destroyed the Los Angeles basin. Those are all things that we know are at risk, but it's hard to get your mind around that magnitude.
Communication is the key, but in our modern world, the most advanced communication systems can also be the most fragile. Literally, one of the first things destroyed by the Campfire was the phone, internet, and cable lines serving the Ridge and the Oroville EOC.
And I personally got a lot of phone calls from other educators I know, and they're like, what can we do? My first is communication. I think always in natural disaster, communication is the key. Like I said, unfortunately in the Campfire, the rate of spread of the fire brought down cell towers, and so it really destroyed major communication lines. So that as a result, there was very little information that was able to be sent out to the public.
It's not just one method of notifying people that's going to be the way to go. We have to have a lot of tools in our tool belt, whether it's door to door, if it's sirens, if it's the phone calls, the emergency mass notification system, if it's loudspeaker, whether it's aircraft going through with a loudspeaker. You know, we need more than just one notification system, which I believe we do now, and we're working to find more. What else is out there?
Government can't do it alone. It takes every one of us.
This might be the most important message we have for you. Even as we prepare, most of us have a lingering feeling when a catastrophe strikes, someone will be there to help. If we call 911, surely someone will come. But this is the blunt truth. Sometimes no one is coming. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you this to help. In disasters, there is a numbers problem no civilization has ever solved.
We're going to have an incident that you will not get a fire truck at your house to help you. You're going to have to help yourself, and you need to be prepared for it. We're going to try to help you, but we're going to run out of resources, and they're going to take a long time for them to come from Sacramento and Southern California. Law enforcement's not going to have enough officers. You need to understand and prepare your family for the fact of we're going to be impacted by a terrible event, and you are going to have to take care of yourself. And calling 911 is an option, but there's a good chance nobody's going to show up to help you just because of the magnitude of the incident.
It's this. Let's say a disaster hits the Paradise Ridge. Then, let's assume every CALFIRE engine and crew rush in to help, along with everyone from the Sheriff's Department. Then, let's add the 20 personnel from the Paradise Police, and a dozen ambulance crews, and every CHP officer in the county. Now, let's call out every fire engine in nearby Chico and Oroville, and everyone in the Chico and Oroville police departments. Being generous, that's 1,000 people. On the day of the Campfire, over 52,000 people lived on the Paradise Ridge. Even with every single first responder in the county working at the top of their proficiency, there are tens of thousands who will need to self-evacuate without the aid of anyone. This is not because government cuts corners on disaster preparedness. It's not because first responders are not willing to risk their lives to save the day. It's because there are far more people than any town, city, or county can handle.
It takes every citizen out there to recognize the risk that they live in, to be prepared to the degree that they can for that risk, to have insurance so that if that risk comes to bear, that at least they have insurance to fall back to have a vehicle that's operational or some means to rely on somebody else, a reliability that they know is there. To have an emergency plan, individuals have to be in a position to help themselves. Public safety officials will do all that they can, but it's just, there's too many people on a broad scale emergency developing that rapidly to be able there to help everybody.
I think it's really crucial for people to know that cavalry's not going to come and get you, that you have to take your life, your family, and preparation into your own hands. And you have to prepare for yourself. Don't sit with your car with a quarter of a tank of fuel in it. Always have fuel in your car. Always have a go bag ready. And when you think that you might need to evacuate, leave. Don't wait for someone to tell you to go. It's better to be safe than sorry. And if you are a person who doesn't have a vehicle, doesn't drive anymore, know that you've got to have someone you can call. Maybe that's your next door neighbor. Hopefully it is someone who's so close to you that they can get you in a vehicle to get out. But you have to be prepared for yourself.
Which is why it comes back to individuals having to be develop their own evacuation plan, their own safety plan within the context of the broader plan developed by public safety. And things like understanding your neighborhood and your area. And people would often go, well, we need you to tell us what our evacuation route is. And my response would often be, I don't necessarily know what your evacuation route is going to be because I don't necessarily know what threat you're going to be facing. In the case of a wildfire, we could designate a particular road as evacuation area, but as you saw, spot fires could develop that close that road off. And so you need to be prepared to get out of your neighborhood in an alternate route.
Regionally, and we plan for potentially having to evacuate Paradise. What happens when people leave Paradise, they all go down the hill to Chico. Even those that are routed down Pence Road to Highway 70 ultimately come back to Chico. One of the things that we learned in our planning is that we need to look more regional. We can't just look at the city of Chico because they become, that city became gridlocked at obviously during the Campfire. We need to look about, hey, we can't let people route back to Chico, for instance. If they're going down this way, we need to route them to Marysville, to Yuba City, to Sacramento even. We need to think more broadly and more regionally about the magnitude of an incident and what those downstream impacts will be, if you will. And that would be my biggest suggestion to my colleagues across the country, to local governments, and to citizens. Be prepared. It's about all of us being prepared, not just groups of us.
And I think we have preached quite well preparedness. And I think everybody focuses on what they can do for their house and evacuation, but I think people need to mentally prepare for an incident. Not only what happened that day that the residents were exposed to, that I don't think they were mentally prepared for, but the effects after the fire. The fact that the town has been destroyed, everybody's lives have been turned upside down, and it's not going back to normal anytime soon. And I don't think we've experienced anything on this magnitude where people can comprehend of it's years, if it even happens, of things going back to normal. And I don't think we're prepared emotionally and mentally for the impacts of an entire community being destroyed. How you prepare for that, I don't know. And how you tell the civilians that this could happen, that your life will never be the same. You may never be able to go back to your home. Your school may never open back up. Every fire we've had before, done, we rebuild, we kind of go back to normal. Even on the major wildland fires we had in the last couple years, things kind of get back to normal because they're still part of a community there. In this case, as you live there, things aren't back to normal yet. And I don't see them getting back to normal for a long time. It'd be easy for me to sit here and tell other fire leaders, hey, prepare. But I don't think anybody needs to be told that, right? I think we all know that. What we need to start educating people on is the post-disaster is difficult. And you need to start preparing for the post-disaster of, and I keep bringing this up. It'd be no different than that major earthquake that hit San Francisco. We all know that it could come, and we all know it's going to be devastating. But I think truly people think that, okay, it hits, my house gets destroyed, 6 months later, we're right back in driving to work. It's not the case.
Many of these lessons are to get people through the danger of disaster. But what about when the danger has passed? Have you thought about how you or your organization will provide normal services when everyone, employees and the public, are dealing with disaster? If they've lost their homes and possessions, where will they stay? This part is for everyone to think about. Where will you get the clothes you need, the medicine, the personal goods? How will you continue to work? As an organization, how will your employees perform if they're now homeless? What allowances will you give personnel dealing with trauma, or who are pushed to leave the area by the economic and housing forces unleashed by the disaster? Part of disaster planning is the recovery, which could be anywhere from days to years. Recovery of operations, maintaining the norms that we can, is vital to give ourselves the sense that we can persevere through the worst.
But I don't know that we know the total impact yet. I think that's years to come.
There definitely is an awareness now that this could happen anywhere.
I see it driving through certain areas. Properties that I've known over the years to not be clean suddenly are clean. I hear people talking about it, where before it was that government telling us we should do something. Now people, it's a ground up push, make it safe to live in these beautiful places people want to live.
What will come out of this, at least my hope, is that people will be inspired to take personal responsibility for their own safety, that they won't rely upon someone else to develop an evacuation or safety plan for them.
We were fortunate that we didn't lose anybody on the evacuation day. We had 52 clients that we helped evacuate and the 250 employees. Out of the 250 employees, all but maybe 10 of them lost their homes. I can't stress disaster preparation enough. Kind of like muscle memory. I mean, if you do it over and over and over again, it gets to be a routine. Granted, once the spot fires happen, and the urgency of the situation, your heartbeat was racing a little more than just a drill. But it did give us an idea of what we needed to do.
So that is what we survivors of the Campfire can fit into this program. I know these preparations saved me, they saved Bob, and tens of thousands more. After the pain and struggle of our experience, I can only hope that you can use these lessons and add to them for you, your friends, family, colleagues, and citizens. You may feel comfortable now, thinking that you are never really going to have to deal with all this. But take it from me, now is the time to prepare. The price is too high to ignore.